considering thinking about leaders, particularly elders specifically, that not only with Timothy and Titus, but keep remembering that there are other places in the Bible where we get some very clear ideas about what leaders are supposed to be. And don't skip this one, because this one specifically says elders, doesn't it? It's talking about church leaders. And so this is not a passage that needs to be left out of the equation. So 3 knots here. Let's read that passage again. It's a real short one, the first 4 verses. So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. So the first knot here to look at, not under compulsion, or as some speak of, not by constraint. I'm sure that some of you are way ahead of me on this as you think about Timothy and Titus, and they're talking about if anyone desires the office. We get tripped up in these words that we always think on, yeah, we do have to think about it. We're not talking about somebody who wants it for the wrong reasons. Motivation is always a key with God. You know, you can do the right thing, and it really is not worth a whole lot from your viewpoint as far as you and God are concerned if you don't do it for the right reasons. But you, as a person who wants to be a leader in the church, specifically, you know, is concerned, the concept here is they have to be willing to. Where this is deal with you too.
Yeah.
Where we're looking for prosperity elders, when we're trying to cultivate that concept in a young person's life, they have to be willing to. They have to be willing to. They have to want to. They have to be accepting of it. If you have to just beat them into it, they're not going to make a very good job. Now, why anybody would want the job, I don't know. That's a pretty negative statement, considering the fact that I'm in the business of promoting the whole concept. But there are negative aspects to the job, and there's a lot of responsibility to it. And it's real easy to start thinking about, hey man, I've got enough on my plate already. I've got enough on my plate already spiritually, just taking care of me. I don't want to be responsible for 50 others or 5,000 others or something like that. And you are if you're an elder. The same goes for being a teacher or a preacher or anything else to a degree. Let not many of you be teachers, brothers. James says, you know, every time I start to teach, I think about that. What on earth are you doing up there, you doofus? You don't need to be teaching, because that just is more responsibility for yourself sometimes. So what on earth are you doing trying to explain to other people how they need to be doing? Then I remind myself that that's not what I'm doing. What I'm trying to convey is what God is asking of us. I'm not asking anything of you from me. I'm right there among you. I happen to be standing up here rather than sitting back there where I want to be. But somebody's got to do it. And we all are responsible. When you get right down to the final nitty-gritty, we'll all stand before the judgment seat of God, right? You know, so we are responsible. It's just that elders have this additional responsibility. So it's no wonder that some people would say, okay, I appreciate the offer, I appreciate being considered, but then they tell the elders that are already there, thank you, but no thank you. Not out of constraint. They have the desire to care for and administer to God's people. If an elder feels like the work is too much, here's something to think about that maybe you haven't thought of or haven't thought of in a while. My job is just to try to remind us of things that we already know. Then basically they've disqualified themselves. There are a lot of really good reasons as well as other reasons that are not so flattering why someone might step down. This is not a Supreme Court assignment. You know, Supreme Court justices are there for life, but even they can step down. They just never do. What we need to be thinking about when someone is an elder and they've got circumstances in their life that make it very difficult for them to continue the responsibilities, we need to encourage them. We need to support them in their decision if they decide that they no longer need to be serving. There are a lot of good reasons for that. I'll just give you a couple. You can get to the point where your age and energy just will not allow you to do the job. Remember, job versus position, you know. They've still got the energy to sit behind the big mahogany desk with the sign says boss. Unfortunately, that's not the job description. So when they can't do the job of an elder, they don't need to be an elder. And if they are smart enough to realize that, then we need to let them go. That makes them no less a Christian. It makes them no less a Christian. Or their health just deteriorates to the point where they are not physically able. Or a family member, maybe their spouse needs full-time care and they're just wrapped up in that hot and heavy and they just can't do it. There are all kinds of reasons, and I'm not going to try to give you a long list. I'm just trying to throw out the concept that we need to be aware of, that elders are humans. They have their situations, and if that situation is one that's going to impact them from here on, then it's perfectly fine to say, you know, I'm really no longer qualified to do this job. If the candidate decides that the job is just a burden, I don't want this because, man, it's just too heavy a load. I just don't want it. They don't really need to be an elder. It may be, in some cases, that it's pretty clear that they're looking for, you know, I'd kind of like to do this, but I really don't want to have to do anything. You know, that's always a possibility. I've known of, in the secular world, I've known of several instances of where people liked the title, they just didn't like what went with it. Yeah, but they love the title. Not for dishonest gain. ESV says, not for shameful gain. You know, anytime you have a position of leadership, there's always the possibility that you can profit from it. Sometimes if it weren't so wrong, I could almost, because my mind works in weird ways, I could almost find some humor in this. But I will change the circumstances and the item involved to protect the innocent. We need chicken. Or as Linda and I like to say, chicken. And we need chicken regularly for our potlucks and stuff. And that chicken bill is beginning to mount up. But one of our members happens to be an executive with Kentucky Fried Chicken. Now, they're a scoundrel, and everybody knows they're a scoundrel, but they're a good old boy, and so we make them a deacon or an elder because we can get a good deal on chicken. And you think that's amusing, and I do too. But I could also tell you the name of a person, And they weren't in the chicken business, but that's basically how they got their position. And some of you are nodding, and that means you've run across that too before. Well, not for dishonest gain. Not at the expense of the church. We don't do that. We don't allow that. Shepherds are supposed to be providers, not takers. Shepherds are supposed to be providers, not takers. Well, not as being lords. Not domineering over those in your charge is the idea here. Not domineering over those in your charge. This is one of those threads that is interwoven with almost every instance of where God's people are being led and God is saying, this is how I want this to work. Someone has to lead, but that doesn't mean that they do it with the iron fist. That's not what God wants. That same idea just shows up again and again in the scriptures. Flock doesn't belong to the elders, remember? What about this idea of lordship? What does it look like? I think almost all of us know what it looks like. If we transfer it from the church realm into the secular realm, we know what it looks like. And it looks much the same inside the church. There are several examples of what lordship would look like. Do the decisions center around that person? Yeah. Whatever is decided, it has to be their idea, or they got to think it's their idea. And so all the decisions center around that particular individual. Are people intimidated by that person's presence? Okay, now, here's one you have to watch out for. Some of us just look intimidating. We're not. We're a wuss. I'm tempted to mention this person's name, but I won't, even though they're deceased. But they had a very stern exterior, and they were funny as all get out, but you had to find that out for yourself. But if you generally find that that person is intimidating, and you know that they're intimidating because of your personal experience with them, it's not just looks alone, then that's kind of that lordship idea. How about when you mess up? What's their reaction? Are you scared of how they're going to react? That would be lordship. The fact of the matter is, we're all going to mess up. How are we going to deal with it? How is that person going to deal with it? That has an awful lot to do with what lordship looks like. Are these the kind of folks that intimidate people into doing things how they want them done? For example, I will tell you how you will interpret the scriptures. That's not God's plan. Elders are not to be in the business of telling anyone how to interpret the scriptures. They are in the business of trying to correct error, sure. But there are several passages in the Bible that if you know exactly what they mean, you tell me. You tell me. I'd love to know. And then I would also, being the kind of turkey that I am, I'd like to know, how do you know that? We'll talk more about this idea of binding non-scriptural concepts on people further into it. But these are some knots. Not under compulsion, not for gain, and not domineering. All of these qualifications are just as important as Timothy and Titus. It says so right here in the book, right? So when we look to others, and remember the application here, you are scouting for future elders and future leaders. You're always on the prowl farm. You're always looking at little kids saying, okay, what can I do to help them grow into this? You're always looking at 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds. And I don't know how much further along the road, but are they a prospect? Are they a prospect? Because I am blunt, I've even told some guys, I would like to see you work on this. Because you would make a good elder, I think. Work on this aspect. Work on this aspect. And we want the leaders that we have to be men who are qualified. And seeing as how they're not perfect either, as I think just about all of ours, if not all, have told you that publicly to begin with, then we need to help and encourage them along the way. We know where our target is. Let's aim for the target. Shepherds must be examples. Sheep in the agricultural world, and I know very little about agriculture. I'm not country. I just sound country. I'm small town. I'm not urban, but I've seen sheep. I bet I've seen about as many sheep as most of you in here have. And I've seen how that works. And sheep just naturally follow the ones who take care of them. They just naturally seem to do that. Now, you've seen that in other livestock, I'll bet. You've seen the farmer out there in the field and a string of cows going after them, Now, that's more our part of the world, but most all of us have seen that before. Sheep are just the very same way. They pretty much follow who's going to feed them, who's going to take care of them. But if the sheep won't follow a particular shepherd, I'd say that shepherd's not very effective. Are you talking about people, Ron? Yeah. If they won't follow them, they're not much good as a shepherd. And any shepherd that resorts to being a dictator is not a very effective shepherd, and they're really not qualified. Look at verse 4 here. It's a reminder to all shepherds and to us who are looking towards them. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Just a reminder to all shepherds that there is the ultimate shepherd. So we have to kind of keep our focus on that. Now there is another aspect of this, so I'm always fond, as I sometimes say, and this can really bog you down, but it's necessary to a degree. I like to look at both sides of the coin, and then sometimes I look at the edge, and then I have to mull all that over. And you can spend a lot of time just thinking through it. But there's a very basic aspect of the flip side of this coin, and that is there's the responsibility of the flock. We've been talking about leaders of a certain type. The flock also have a responsibility. There are two qualifiers to this, and it's important to keep the qualifiers in mind. The leaders must be qualified and they must be following scriptural patterns. We do not blindly follow bad leaders. I know I'm going to beat it to death. I'm already beating several things to death. But when I get done with this, it'll be the last time I stand up here to do a series of lessons. And if nothing else, I want you to remember certain core things. I want you to be reminded of them if you already knew them, and you probably already do. We do not follow any human blindly. We do not. So those leaders must be qualified, and they must be following scriptural patterns. And if they are doing that, we owe them submission. Look at verse 5 here. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Godly shepherds can't do what they need to do if the flock is rebellious. If they're bent on their own way, it's just not going to work. I've never been in the middle of something like that, so I really don't clearly understand it, to be honest. But I can imagine looking at it in a literal sense. I did see a man. We were driving along a country lane in New Zealand, and he had his dogs had a large flock of sheep penned in a corner of a paddock. And I was videoing it. And he comes walking down the paddock and he says, "What are you doing?" Because I'm there with my little camcorders filming away. And I said, "I've never seen anything like this. I'm from Kentucky. Never seen sheep being tended like this. And I'm just videoing it because it's interesting to me." And he said, "Would you like to see how the dogs work?" "Yes, sir." And to my horror, he scatters the sheep. And I'm saying, "No, no." And he just laughs. And he says, 5 minutes, they'll be back where they are. So I saw sheep scattered. That kind of horrified me for a minute, because I'm thinking of all the work it's going to take to get them back together, which turned out he was right, of course. But imagine how horrible it would be for us to be scattered. We rely on each other. We encourage each other. We support each other. We matter to each other. To be scattered would be awful. We don't want someone that will end up causing us to be scattered. Just don't want that. And godly shepherds can't deal with a whole bunch of unruly sheep. They're just not going to listen when they are qualified men who are following scriptural patterns. There are two groups that are specified here, you notice. One group is singled out specifically, the younger man. Please don't take this, because I know we've got many young men in here. This is not meant to be okay, and this is talking to you, bud. No. But he does specify younger men, because there is a tendency among younger, not all, but there is a tendency among some young men to be basically, nobody's going to tell me nothing. And that's not a good move. That's just not a good move. They're more likely to be a source of arrogance and insubordination than most other groups. Maybe guys like me have kind of lost our fire, so we don't really get all that riled up. And maybe we should sometimes. But specifically, if you are younger, kind of watch that tendency if you have it.
My observation is that most of us pretty much know ourselves better than anybody else. We may be in a state of denial, but don't you know your own weaknesses pretty well, really? And you've lived with them all your life. Surely you've got a clue, you know. So you know pretty much what you can do and where your weak spots are. And you can be sure the devil knows. He also speaks about the whole church, though. He doesn't just stay with younger ones only. I can't help but think about the occasion for a man asking for advice, and he asks the young ones, and they say, "Tighten down on them, tighten down on them." And he goes to the old ones and says, "Hey, everybody's doing okay. Let it ride. Just let it ride like it is." I take a look at that story sometimes. The whole church, all of you, are to be in submission to the elders. If they are qualified, if they are following a scriptural pattern. There is a place that epitomizes shepherdhood, I think, if there is such a word as shepherdhood. Let's look at the 23rd Psalm. I imagine most of you could quote it, or you could surely quote most of it. I guess 23rd would not be the same as 32, would it? You can have it there in your lap, but just listen to it. Just listen to it and think about the beauty of a godly shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Is that not beautiful? Is that not beautiful? How sweet, how tender, how wonderful to be led by a shepherd like that. And that's what we want from the leaders of our kingdom. That's what we're looking for. Unfortunately, it doesn't always turn out like that. Let's look at a real prize of a leader, sarcastically, in 3 John. We can't absolutely be sure, as far as I know. If I'm wrong, correct me right now, and that way anybody who happens to be watching this or happens to be a visitor here, we can straighten up and clean up my mistake right here with the ones that need to know accurately. We don't know for certain that Diotrephes was an elder, but we do know that he was a leader. He definitely was a leader. We can skip on down to verse 9. There is almost built into some people a thirst for power. Some people are very ambivalent about it. They don't really care much one way or the other. But an awful lot of us, we crave power. to one degree or another. And this man was power hungry. It just cuts to the chase right off the bat on how he's described. I've written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first. Now, how would you like to have your name inserted where Diotrephes is? Yes? I don't think so. Diotrephes loved power, and we'll see where that power took him. To extremes that you would not think anyone would have the gall to even imagine. He loved to have the preeminence. That's exactly the opposite of the servanthood example of Christ. It's exactly the opposite of what Christ tried to make sure his apostles understood greatness was. Quit going for who's going to be on my right and my left. I don't have it to give anyway, and you don't know what you're talking about. You got no clue as to what you're even asking for. But Diotrephes, hey, he loves the number one slot. And unfortunately, that kind of leadership is a very common one in the religious world today. Notice that I'm broadening it out beyond just the kingdom. I've never set in on anything like this, but I've heard secondhand accounts of how it went, and it is not good to even hardly mention. Church business meetings that turn into power struggles, factions arguing against each other and determine each one to have their way. That might be in a small congregation that don't have elders, and so it is literally a business meeting and that's going to help to decide decisions that affect the congregation, or it might be a congregation that has elders. But it's a battleground. Here's a common image: the corporate boardroom. We've got the fancy paneling around the walls and the long mahogany desk. We've seen them in movies if we haven't seen them in the real world. And the head elder, of course, is sitting at the end. And these will decide what the congregation should do, and we will let them know, and it's on a need-to-know basis. That's not good either. You remember all those cultural influences on leadership that we talked about? Yeah. Political influence, economic influence, and so on, where people begin to view things in terms of worldly power. All those things can enter into turning someone into being power hungry. And so that authoritarian leadership of the first century was what Jesus was trying to combat when he said, "It shall not be so among you." That's not what he wanted. Peter's admonishing the people back there where we just came from in chapter 5, not to be lords over. That's not the way it's supposed to be. God is domineering over those in your charge. There are dictators in the world, but they're only disciples in the church. There are sovereigns in the world, but they're only slaves in the church. What a mess. How do they even get there? I'm not smart enough to figure stuff out about where you draw lines. That has been one of the giant puzzles of my life. Where do you draw a line? You know, it's ridiculous to draw a line and say, don't come within 500 miles of the Grand Canyon because you might fall over. On the other hand, I think it's about equally ridiculous I'm not about to do this with the Grand Canyon down there, not even that floor. But to stand on one foot and dangle the other one over to get a great selfie before you fall. Hope you had the sound on. Somewhere back yonder, this guy should have been stopped. That's the line I'm talking about. It's real easy to see in hindsight, we shoulda, coulda, woulda. I'm a history major. I don't remember very many things that I was told specifically, but I remember this one because I thought, even as a dumb 20-year-old, this made a lot of sense. Hindsight, as he put it then in the late 60s, is worth about a nickel a ton. I'm sure with inflation now it's probably up to 15 cents. Hindsight is worth about a nickel a ton. But somewhere in there, and that's the tough part of being a leader, guys like Diotrephes need to be stopped. And usually we err on the too late, too little side. But somehow or another, man, this guy had really created a mess. How'd they let him get in control? Have you ever known of congregations that had chief elders like Diotrephes may have been? Don't answer that. And on the other hand, we've got a contrast here as you read this account in 3 John, and that's where we'll come back to when we're together next time. But we've got this other man by contrast, yes. And he won't let this man do his job. This man's trying to do God's work, and he's actually trying to hinder him because it's going to be done his way, and he's not going to let this guy have anything to do with doing it right. He doesn't want anybody around that threatens his position. Look at verse 9. Look at part B of verse 9. Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. Yeah. I don't care if you're an apostle or not. We're going to do this my way. What a mess. We'll look at more about this example as we come together again next time. Thank you.